Hi, I'm in the middle of building a cajon. This isn't a video about building a cajon, there's a zillion of those out there on the internet. This is a video about a circle cutting jig for a Festool 1010 router. There's also a lot of videos out there for circle cutting jigs, but they tend to be for large circles. They're based upon compasses or trammels, and I wanted something a bit more compact that would drill small to medium sized holes, and something that was specific for the 1010, and I couldn't find anything. There is, however, a website with some plans on Swedish woodworkers, and I thought I'd have a go at that plan. Thanks very much, Swedish woodworkers, and there's a link down below to those original plans. Now, a cajon is a wooden box you sit on and hit. It's a percussion instrument. There's two interesting things, for this video at least. In the back piece of the cajon is a circular hole. Well, mostly people make them circular. That's the baseboard. That helps the sound out. And I have a second function for this. A cajon also typically has a snare leaning against this thin front panel to add a snarey, rattly sound to your percussion. And you want to be able to adjust this snare. You might want it pressing tight against the panel, you might want it loose on the panel, or you might want it away from the panel to not sound at all. Now, you can accomplish this adjustment with knobs at the side, one knob, two knobs, but I don't like the look of that. I wanted something else, and I like the approach where you reach in through the baseboard at the back. So you need a hole in the back, big enough at least to get your hand through. Now, a portion of it, or at least in my set anyway, goes up to about 50mm, and clearly that's out. That's not big enough for your hand to go through. Another option for drilling a large hole is to use a hole cutter. I don't really have a drill press. I use a mini vertical milling machine, which is perfectly fine for small pieces, but getting a large piece on here, particularly this distance here, isn't really feasible. I haven't ever used this, and if ever I do, I'm going to have to just trim it very slightly, because it happens to bang into the depth stop lever when the depth stop is locked, as I would usually have it. The other thing is, I suspect that the hole this drills is not going to be as neat as a router would make it. This is my router. It's a Festool 1010, and this circle cutting jig relies upon a part of this setup here. This is the track, for routing a straight line. And part of that setup is this adapter here, which is fitted into the router. This adapter here is what rides along the track. It has a couple of adjusters here to make sure you've got a snug fit of the track into this channel, but that's not the interesting bit. The interesting bit is these two arms along which the router can move, and these four holes here, which look conveniently as though they're going to take a 4mm bolt. And the idea is going to be that we attach our adapter to a nice piece of wood, and we run the router up and down here. We put a pivot pin in the base, and around that pivot we can rotate, and it can be pretty close to the cutter point. Now, ideally I would use something 9mm, but that's the biggest piece of 9mm I've got around at the moment, and I want to get going on this, so I'm going to use a piece of 6mm ply. I suspect that the pivot pin will not be particularly stable, but I'm going to give it a try, and if it all works nicely I'll probably do it again in 9mm, but I just want to get going. For the pivot I'm not going to use a spike. I doubt if I'd be able to hold the jig steady around a spike, and I imagine some work pieces would be quite hard to spike into. So I've got this piece of 4mm steel rod. It's a bit rusty at one end, obviously been down in the store quite a while. A 4mm brad point drill should make a nice snug hole in the jig and in the workpiece. Now we need to attach this adapter to the base, and I'm going to use, as I said, these four rather convenient holes here. They are blind holes. I'm never quite sure how one lines those up with drillings that are going to come through from underneath to take the 4mm bolts that will hold the whole thing together. So I'm going to use a piece of paper, and I've left the rails on here so that I don't make a mistake as to which way around this thing goes. And I'm going to line up my adapter's edges both here and here to the piece of paper, and then using some of this clever low-tack magic tape I'll attach the paper like that, hoping that I don't put the tape over the drill holes to be. And then we can just turn this over and we can locate those holes. I'm making a little indentation which I can see. Push that through there. There it is. There it is. And now I can take my sheet of paper, remembering that it's not that way round, but it is in fact that way round, and through those holes I can now mark up my piece of wood. I'm going to use these 4mm bolts. They have a rather flat pan head to them, so I'm making some recesses for those pan heads with my smallest Forstner bit, and a Forstner bit leaves a nice little dink in the middle into which my 4mm brad can find its way and complete the hole. The next challenge is tapping the holes. Those drillings at the bottom of the adapter have no threads, and to ease a 4mm bolt cutting its thread in plastic, so it shouldn't have too difficult a job, I understand that one can make a little cut with a fine triangle file, for example, and with that little cut turn it into something of a tap. So let's have a go. Okay, and this is the channel cut out of the end of the bolt so that I can form a thread cutting surface. Now it's time to cut the bolts down to the required size. Always a good idea to thread a nut on first. Help you clean up the cut threads. And 4. Okay, I've been cutting these threads. One left to go. I assume that, like a metal thread, backing it occasionally to clear the pieces is a good idea. Now let's get this mounted using the shorter bolts that I prepared earlier. And of course I'm hoping I don't have to, well, let's also have the board on the correct side. And yes, hoping I don't have to put all of them all the way in with the sweat and tears screwdriver. Have the adapter fixed to the baseboard. Let's just check that these rods are tight. This doesn't do anything, it's just to hold on to, I assume. I have a couple of pieces of double-sided tape fixed to the workmate.
I don't like sacrificial baseboards for some reason or other, they seem inelegant, but I'm going to route into this channel in the middle here, and I have a 1/2 inch straight cut plunge bit in my router. So let's get this. First of all, let's just check where the cutter is, because I suspect it's not central. Okay, and get that taped down onto the double-sided tape. And now we're ready to cut the channel for the bit into the baseboard. Let's pop the cutter to touch the surface, lock that off. Loosen the post, raise this up by 8mm, lock that off. Luckily, a nice clean cut isn't necessary. Of course, these are pretty wobbly, so as it plunged in, it did wobble a little bit. I was just pondering that this, as we said earlier, is a little bit thin for having a nice stable pivot pin. So I thought to myself, I'll put a reinforcing block of wood here. Of course, that's pretty stupid, because then the base couldn't ride up to touch here, so no. Assuming I'll continue to use a Forstner bit, typically for holes up to 50mm, and that being the diameter, a radius of 25, I don't really need the pivot point much closer than that to the end of the cutter channel here. So I think I'll do 15mm, would be there. I've taken the rods out, that wouldn't have worked. So let's tidy up the end of this rusty rod. I think 1cm should do nicely. Cleaned up the end of this pivot pin a little bit, and it seems to be a nice snug fit, so let's find a pounding place. I have a 1/4 inch cutter in the router. Put my rails back on the jig, and I have a scrap piece of wood. We'll need a 4mm pivot hole, and I've marked the spot. Although the pivot in the base here needs to be snug, this one will be a pest if it's too snug. Now let's see if we can locate that. It's not going to be easy. Down and touch the baseboard. Give ourselves an extra 12 or so millimeters. From the centre of the pivot to the edge of the cutter, I want about 45mm. And there we are. Not too bad.